Hey there! Tonight we're drifting into a story that feels like an echo rather than a proclamation. A myth shaped by longing, by choices made too softly to stop fate, and by consequences that unfolded long after the moment had passed. This is not a tale of sudden endings, but of slow realizations, the kind that arrive only after everything has already changed. If these quiet ancient stories help your thoughts unwind, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a calm comment. Maybe just where you're listening from, or what hour the night has reached for you. Only if it feels gentle. Now let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day loosen its grip, as we step into an ancient world where love did not always save, where hope lingered just a moment too long, and where even the gods learned that some losses cannot be undone. This is where our story begins. In the shadowed threshold where breath meets oblivion, a single form stood eternal watch. Not with the clamour of chains or the roar of infernal flames, but with the unyielding patience of stone worn by endless tide. The dead waited before him, their silent pleas dissolving into the void. For in his duty lay the inexorable boundary no soul could cross unbidden. The underworld stretched then as a vast, formless expanse, neither cavern nor plain, but a realm shaped by absence itself. Mists coiled through endless corridors of grey, where echoes faded before sound could form. Rivers of forgetfulness wound slowly, their waters dark and still, carrying the weight of memories relinquished. Shades wandered in perpetual dusk, forms translucent and heavy with unfinished longing. No throne commanded the centre. No lord presided over the silence. Amid this, the guardian moved. Let us call him Vesper. For though his name was lost to the annals, when gods rose, it lingers in the hush of evening's fall. Vesper, but the keeper of the veil, tasked from creation's dawn with holding the divide between life and death. His form was tall and spare, cloaked in robes woven from twilight threads, his eyes deep sockets reflecting the calm of untroubled waters. He carried no weapon, no key, only a lantern of pale light, its flame steady and cool, illuminating paths that led nowhere. Each cycle, as the world above turned through light and dark, a Vesper began his ritual. He traversed the threshold's edge, where the living realm's echoes met the dead's silence. The lantern swung gently from his hand, casting light that pierced the veil without tearing it. With each step, he reinforced the boundary a touch to mist that solidified into barrier, a gaze upon shades that stilled their restless drift. The dead gathered near, drawn by the faint pull of what they had left behind, lovers' calls, children's laughter, battles unresolved. Vesper met their eyes without word, his presence alone turning them back, duty woven into every fibre of his being. In the deeper hollows, where forgotten souls clustered like leaves in autumn wind, Vesper paused to align the flows. His fingers brushed a shade's translucent form, and memory settled, not erased, but held in place, preventing the surge that could flood the living world with regret. The shades bowed subtly, their whispers a faint rustle, unaware that without his touch, their longing might pierce the veil and drag the living down. From there, but he moved to the riverbanks, where waters lapped at invisible shores. Vesper stood in the shallows, lantern raised, calibrating the current, ensuring forgetfulness came slowly, mercifully, without drowning the essence that made each soul unique. As the cycle wound, Vesper ascended to the high archway, a natural span of obsidian bridging life and death. Here, the newly departed arrived, forms fresh with the shock of ending. Warriors clutched phantom wounds. Mothers reached for absent children. Kings gripped sceptres turned to dust. Vesper waited at the centre, lantern steady. His voice a rare murmur, when needed not judgment, but affirmation of the passage complete. He guided them inward with a gesture, the boundary sealing behind like mist closing over water. But in this era, before the gods divided the realms, a murmur stirred in the upper world. Titans fell, Olympians rose. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades drew lots for sky, sea, and underworld. The draw was cast in shadows, the brothers' hands steady yet heavy with fate's weight. Zeus claimed the heavens, his thunder rumbling in acceptance. Poseidon took the depths, waves crashing in accord. Hades received the dead, his expression unchanging, a veil of quiet resolve. Word descended slowly to the underworld, carried on winds that pierced the veil for the first time. Shades stirred uneasily, forms flickering like candles in draught. Rivers rippled without cause, currents testing their banks. Vesper felt it at the archway, a faint tremor in the boundary, like threads straining in a loom not yet broken. He did not hasten. He completed his circuit, lantern swinging in unchanged rhythm. But at the threshold's edge, he paused longer, gazing upward where light from the living world filtered dimly through cracks. The gods' ascent echoed faintly, clash of arms fading, new order settling. Vesper's eyes remained calm, yet the lantern's flame dipped slightly, casting longer shadows across his robes. The dead gathered closer now, their whispers deepening to low hum. A warrior shade reached toward the light, hand dissolving at the boundary's touch. Vesper extended his arm, not in rebuke, but in gentle redirection. The shade withdrew, but the longing lingered in the air, thicker than before. As night fell above, Hades prepared his descent. Cloaked in darkness, helm in hand, he stood at the world's edge, gazing into the abyss that would become his kingdom. No joy marked his face. Only duty, the inexorable pull of fate drawn. Vesper sensed the approach, a weight pressing against the veil from outside. He planted his feet at the archway, lantern raised higher. The flame steadied, illuminating the path downward. No resistance rose in him, no rebellion stirred, only waiting, the quiet endurance of one who had held the boundary alone since time's beginning. The rivers slowed their flow, shades stilled their wander. The mists thickened, as though the realm itself anticipated the change. And in that anticipation, the first subtle fracture appeared, not in stone or veil, but in the Guardian's unending vigil, a hint that duty's cost might soon demand reckoning. Hades descended without sound, his footsteps absorbed by the mists that parted before him like curtains, drawn in slow reverence. The air thickened with each step downward, carrying the scent of damp stone and faded memory. Rivers slowed their flow as he approached, waters smoothing into mirrors that reflected nothing. Shades drifted toward the threshold, forms flickering with faint curiosity, drawn by the new weight that settled over the realm. Vesper waited at the obsidian archway, lantern held steady, its pale flame casting long shadows that stretched toward the newcomer. No greeting passed between them. Hades paused at the boundary, dark cloak settling around him, like night folding into itself. His eyes, deep and unreadable, met Vesper's across the divide. Recognition flickered once, brief as a candle in wind. The old guardian acknowledging the new lord, duty yielding to duty. Hades stepped through. The boundary rippled, a subtle wave travelling outward, then stilled. The lantern's light dimmed for an instant, as though the realm itself adjusted to the shift. Vesper lowered the flame slowly, turning without haste to resume his circuit. The dead watched in silence, their whispers ceasing entirely. The rivers resumed their gentle lap, but with a new cadence, deeper, more deliberate. Hades moved through the hollows, not as conqueror, but as one claiming what fate had assigned. He walked the riverbanks, fingers trailing through the dark waters. Forgetfulness stirred at his touch, memories sinking deeper into the current without protest. He stood at the gathering places, where shades clustered, his presence alone enough to still their restless drift. No commands issued from his lips. No throne was raised. He simply walked, and the realm reshaped itself around him, mists thickening where needed, paths forming beneath his feet, silence deepening into order. Vesper continued his ritual unchanged. Lantern swinging gently, he traversed the threshold's edge, touching mist that solidified under his palm. The boundary held firm, yet something had altered. The light now met resistance, where before it had passed freely. A shade approached him, a mother's form, arms still outstretched toward the world above. Vesper met her gaze, but guiding her back with the familiar gesture. She withdrew, but her eyes lingered on the distant figure of Hades, who watched from the river's far bank. The first quiet consequences began to unfold. In the upper world, the newly dead arrived more slowly, their passage marked by a faint hesitation, as though the veil had grown thicker, but the threshold more deliberate. Mortals felt it in small ways. A loved one's passing lingered longer in the air, grief settling deeper before release. Priests performed rites with heavier hearts, sensing the boundary's new firmness. No chaos followed, no rebellion stirred, only a subtle shift in the rhythm of ending. Below, Hades explored the deeper reaches. He stood at the edge of Tartarus, gazing into its starless depths where the most tormented shades drifted. Their cries muted at his approach, not silenced by force, but calmed by the weight of his presence. He did not bind them further. He simply waited until their unrest subsided, then turned away. The realm responded. Chains that had hung loose tightened of their own accord. Pits deepened where needed, yet mercy remained woven into every adjustment. Vesper felt the changes in his bones. At each pause along the boundary, the lantern's flame flickered longer, as though drawing from a different source. The shades gathered nearer to him still, yet their attention divided, eyes drifting toward the new lord, who moved through the hollows with measured steps. Vesper did not hasten. He completed his circuit, returning to the archway at the cycle's end. Hades waited there, standing motionless, cloak pooling around him like spilled night. No words passed. Hades inclined his head once, subtle acknowledgement of the guardian's long vigil. Vesper returned the gesture, lantern lowering until its light rested at his feet. Then Hades turned inward, walking deeper into the realm that was now his. Vesper remained at the threshold, watching the dark figure recede, until only the faint outline lingered in the mist. The dead settled into new patterns. Some drifted toward Hades, drawn by the quiet authority that needed no proclamation. Others lingered near Vesper, finding comfort in the familiar light that had guided them so long. The rivers flowed with renewed purpose, forgetfulness coming gently, memories held just long enough to allow farewell. Above, the world turned onward. Sun rose and set. Mortals lived and died. Yet in every passing, the boundary felt different, firmer, more deliberate, as though the hand that held it had changed from patient endurance to measured command. Vesper stood at the archway through the next cycle, lantern raised once more. The flame burned steady, but its light reached farther now, illuminating paths that led toward the heart of the realm. A shade approached, a warrior whose wounds still ached in death. Vesper guided him inward, but this time the shade turned toward Hades's distant form, steps slow and certain. The guardian watched without expression. But duty remained his alone at the threshold, yet the weight of holding the dead had begun to share itself. The lantern's glow softened, casting gentler shadows across the mists. And in that softening, the first quiet question arose, not spoken, but felt in the stillness. What becomes of the guardian when the boundary no longer requires his solitary watch? The cycles deepened. The underworld settling into rhythms shaped by two presences rather than one. Hades walked the inner reaches daily, his steps carving paths that widened into roads of polished obsidian. Rivers bent subtly to his will, Styx coiling stronger, Lethe flowing smoother, their banks holding firm where shades lingered too long. He raised no palace yet, only a simple seat of dark stone at the realm's heart, where he sat in silence, helm beside him, but watching the dead arrive and disperse. Vesper remained at the threshold, lantern swinging in unchanged arc. The flame burned cooler now, its light reaching inward farther than before, guiding newly departed souls along paths that led inevitably toward Hades's quiet seat. Shades arrived with less hesitation, their forms less torn by clinging memory. The boundary held, yet its nature had shifted, less a solitary vigil, more a shared guardianship. Vesper touched the mist less often. The veil sealed itself at Hades's distant presence. The dead adapted in quiet layers. Warriors who once clutched phantom wounds laid them down sooner, drawn by the Lord's calm regard. Mothers released outstretched arms, finding solace in the deepening silence rather than the guardian's gentle redirection. Kings let sceptres dissolve, accepting the equality of shadow. Some shades lingered near Vesper still, finding comfort in the familiar pale light, but most drifted inward, settling into hollows that shaped themselves into fields of asphodel, grey blooms unfurling without sun. Above, the mortal world felt the change in subtle tides. Death came neither sooner nor later, but with greater finality. Grief sharpened at first, loved ones seeming farther, the veil thicker, then softened into acceptance that lingered longer than regret. Funerals grew quieter, rites focused on release rather than reclamation. Oracles spoke of the underworld with new gravity. Not a place of torment alone, but of inevitable order. Hades began to shape the realm more deliberately. He stood at Tartarus's edge and extended a hand, not in binding, but in invitation. The deepest pits responded, walls rising smoother, chains coiling into place for those whose unrest threatened the greater calm. Yet mercy threaded through. No shade suffered beyond its own weight. Elysium's faint outlines emerged in lighter mists, fields where worthy souls walked in pale light, memories held gently rather than stripped. Vesper watched from the archway. The lantern's flame flickered when Hades shaped distant boundaries, as though echoing the new Lord's will. A shade approached, an elder whose life had been spent in quiet service. Vesper raised the light, guiding as always, but the elder paused, eyes turning inward toward the asphodel fields, now visible in the distance. He moved on without redirection, steps steady. The guardian felt the weight lighten, not in relief, but in diffusion. Centuries of solitary holding had carved deep grooves in his essence. Now those grooves filled slowly with shared purpose. He continued the ritual, but pauses lengthened at each station. Fingers brushed mist that needed less reinforcement. The lantern swung lower, its glow merging with the realm's deepening dusk. Hades returned to the archway one cycle. He stood opposite Vesper, neither crossing into the other's domain. The helm rested in his hands, shadows playing across its surface. Shades passed between them, some lingering near the guardian's light, others moving directly toward the Lord. No words exchanged, only the quiet regard of two who understood duty's cost without need for proclamation. The rivers sang faintly now, a low hum beneath their flow, responding to Hades's presence. Lether carried memories away with gentler insistence. Styx bound oaths with firmer thread. The mists parted and closed in measured breath. Above, mortals dreamed less of the threshold. When death came, it arrived as inevitable tide rather than sudden tear. The living honoured the departed with offerings that sank into earth without expectation of return. Boundaries between life and death felt not weaker, but clearer, held by order rather than endless vigil alone. Vesper completed his circuit and returned to the archway. Hades had withdrawn inward, seat occupied in silence. The lantern's flame burned steady, but its light carried a new hue, darker at the edges, as though absorbing the realm's deepening shadow. The dead flowed in steady streams now, neither rushing nor resisting. The guardian watched them pass, hand resting on the obsidian span. Duty remained, yet its solitude had ended, not in diminishment, but in transformation. And in that transformation, the quiet question grew heavier. What role remains for the first guardian when the boundary holds through shared will rather than solitary endurance? The underworld acquired form under Hades's quiet hand. What had once been endless mist and hollow drift now held structure, fields of grey asphodel stretching in measured rows, groves of pale cypress rising along riverbanks, distant halls of polished obsidian emerging where light could never quite reach. Hades moved through these spaces without haste, touching stone that smoothed beneath his palm, guiding currents that carved channels deeper yet gentler. No flourish marked his work. Only necessity shaped the realm into something that could endure eternity. Vesper watched the transformation from the threshold. The lantern in his grasp burned with a steadier, cooler flame, its light now reaching across the asphodel fields, illuminating paths that led directly to Hades's central seat. The boundary no longer demanded constant reinforcement. The veil sealed itself in response to the Lord's presence. Mists parting and closing like breath drawn and released. Shades passed the archway with less resistance, their steps turning inward almost instinctively. The dead found places within the new order. In the asphodel meadows, souls wandered in slow circles, neither joyful nor tormented, simply present. Warriors laid down phantom shields, their forms easing into repose. Mother sat beside pale blooms, hands resting open, the ache of separation softening into memory held without pain. Kings walked among common shades, crowns dissolved, dignity found in equality rather than dominion. Tartarus received its due, those whose lives had twisted into cruelty drawn downward, chains coiling around them, not in cruelty, but in containment, unrest muted by the realm's deepening calm. Vesper continued the ritual, though each circuit grew shorter. Lantern swinging, he touched mist that needed no further solidity. Fingers brushed shades that no longer reached back toward the living world. The weight that had once pressed constantly against his shoulders lightened, not in relief, but in redistribution. Duty remained his at the threshold, yet its solitude had become shared silence. Above, the living world adjusted to the new rhythm. Death arrived with quiet inevitability, final, yet not abrupt. Graves received offerings that sank into earth without expectation of return. Mourners wept, then turned back to life with a steadiness born of knowing the boundary held firm. Priests spoke of Hades with growing reverence, not fear, naming him Lord of the Dead, keeper of balance beneath the earth. Temples rose in his honour, small altars carved with pomegranate seeds and cypress sprigs, offerings left without demand for favour. Hades returned to the archway less often now. When he did, he stood opposite Vesper in mutual regard. The helm rested at his side, shadows playing across its surface. A shade approached between them, an elder whose life had ended in quiet service. The elder paused at the threshold, eyes meeting Vesper's pale light, then turning toward Hades's dark form. He stepped forward without guidance, passing into the asphodel fields. Hades inclined his head once, acknowledgement of the Guardian's long role in easing that passage. Vesper lowered the lantern slightly. The flame reflected in the obsidian span beneath his feet, casting twin glows that merged into one. The rivers sang their low hum in response, Lether carrying away the last traces of clinging regret, Styx binding the realm's new order with unbreakable thread. Mists thickened at the edges, sealing the boundary without need of constant touch. The Guardian felt the shift in his essence. Centuries of solitary holding had etched deep patterns into him, grooves worn by endless vigilance. Now those grooves filled with the realm's own calm, duty flowing outward rather than pressing inward. He completed the circuit and returned to the archway. Hades had withdrawn to his seat, but visible in the distance as a still point amid the grey fields. Shades continued their slow migration inward. The threshold grew quieter, fewer arrivals lingered, fewer reached toward the light. Vesper stood motionless for longer periods, lantern resting at his side. The flame burned low but constant. Its light no longer needed to pierce, but to illuminate what already was. In the upper world, mortals began to speak of the underworld, not as endless void, but as ordered realm, place of rest rather than mere absence. Tales spread of a lord who judged without cruelty, of boundaries that held without malice. The fear of death softened at the edges, replaced by acceptance of passage into something structured, inevitable, and just. Vesper raised the lantern once more as a new shade arrived. A young one whose life had ended too soon. But the guardian guided with familiar gesture. But the youth looked past him, toward the distant seat, steps already turning inward. Vesper watched the figure recede, hand lowering slowly. The boundary held without his touch now, firm, clear, enduring. And in that holding, the guardian's vigil approached its quiet transformation, not an end, but a completion long prepared by the very order he had first sustained alone. The underworld had become a realm of quiet vastness, its spaces measured and enduring. Asphodel fields stretched beneath perpetual dusk, blooms swaying in winds that carried no scent of life. Cypress groves lined the rivers, their branches interlacing into arches that shaded the slow passage of shades. Halls of obsidian rose in the distance, simple, unadorned, yet commanding in their solidity. Hades sat upon his dark seat at the centre, helm resting beside him, his presence the quiet axis around which the realm turned. Vesper stood at the threshold still, but his vigil had grown motionless. The lantern rested at his side, flame low and constant, its light no longer swinging in ritual arc. The boundary held without touch, mist sealing seamlessly, veil firm as woven night. Newly arrived shades crossed the archway, with barely a pause, eyes turning inward toward the asphodel or deeper fields. The guardian's role had narrowed to presence alone, a silent witness at the gate, light offered but rarely needed. The dead had found their places fully now. The long movement of arrival, sorting, and settling had resolved into enduring rhythm. In Elysium's emerging glades, where mists thinned into pale clarity and light carried no heat, worthy souls walked beneath softly glowing canopies. Conversation flowed in low murmurs, words shared without urgency or grasping. Memories were offered freely, not clutched, recollections unfolding like leaves laid gently upon water. Warriors spoke of battles with calm detachment, wounds long healed in essence, if not erased in memory. The fury that once drove them had cooled into understanding. Heroes sat beneath trees of silver bark and quiet radiance, hands open upon their knees, ambition's fire transformed into reflection rather than regret. Deeper still, in Tartarus, the bound endured their containment. There was no spectacle of torment, no excess imposed from without. Instead, each soul faced the weight of its own, unrest mirrored back with perfect clarity. Chains held, but they did not bite. Darkness enclosed, but it did not consume. The punishment was proportion, consequence measured exactly to the soul's dissonance, nothing more, nothing less. Even here, order prevailed. Firm without cruelty, unyielding without malice. Above, the mortal world thrived under the new certainty of passage. Death came as an expected tide, inevitable rhythmic, neither feared as annihilation nor romanticized as mystery. Cities reshaped themselves around this understanding. Necropolises were built with care, streets aligned toward the setting sun, tombs arranged in quiet symmetry. Coins and sprigs of cypress were left in ritual not of desperation, but of respect. Mourners grieved deeply, yet returned to life sooner, grief softening into stories, told around hearth fires, rather than wounds reopened in silence. Children grew hearing of Hades not as devourer, but as Lord who received all equally, rich and poor, mighty and meek, into ordered shadow where no voice was lost and no soul misplaced. Hades shaped the realm with increasing subtlety. He walked the boundaries less often now, trusting the structure to hold without constant presence. His governance had become internal, embedded in flow rather than enforced through command. The rivers moved in perfect cadence. Lethe eased memory's sharpest burdens with gentle insistence, never erasing what shaped the soul, only smoothing what no longer needed to wound. Styx bound oaths so deeply that even death could not loosen them, its dark waters resonating with promises kept and broken alike. Cerberus appeared at the outer gates, not summoned, but shaped organically from the realm's vigilance, 3 heads watchful, bodies relaxed, allowing the worthy to pass without challenge. The ferryman took form upon the dark waters, pole steady, guiding boats that crossed in quiet procession. Coin no longer demanded of all, passage assured by order rather than transaction. Vesper felt the realm's completion in his core. The weight that had once pressed upon him without pause, ages of solitary vigilance, had shifted, now resting shared across the structure of the underworld itself. Hades bore the inner order. Vesper remained the outer threshold. The lantern's flame burned with borrowed shadow now, its edges dark as the Lord's cloak, light no longer blazing but contained, sufficient. Shades passed him without lingering, their steps guided by deeper calm rather than personal guidance. A young shade arrived, one whose life had ended suddenly, but taken by storm and chance rather than age or intention. Vesper raised the light instinctively, the ancient motion carved into his being, but the youth did not pause. Their gaze passed beyond him, drawn toward the distant seat, barely visible through parting mists. The passage completed itself without intervention. Vesper lowered the lantern, understanding settling like stone. Flame touched obsidian and cast no reflection. Duty's grooves, worn deep through solitary ages, had smoothed beneath the new balance. He stood motionless through cycles, form blending with the archway's span, neither advancing nor retreating. The boundary no longer required a figure to define it. It existed. Hades approached the threshold one final time. He stood opposite Vesper, closer than ever before. The space between them filled with shades, moving freely inward, unbroken by pause or hesitation. The Lord's eyes met the Guardian's, recognition deep and wordless, shaped by ages of parallel endurance. Hades extended a hand, not in command, not to summon or dismiss, but in acknowledgement. No grasp was sought. No motion required response. The gesture alone carried meaning, the vigil complete, its purpose fulfilled not by removal, but by permanence. Vesper inclined his head slowly. The lantern dimmed further, light folding inward upon itself. He did not step forward. He did not withdraw. Presence remained, but diffused, woven into the boundary he had once held alone. The rivers hummed their approval, currents deepening into steady harmony. Mists closed gently around the archway, not concealing but integrating. Shades continued their passage undisturbed, the threshold no longer perceived as an obstacle or figure, but as a state of transition held effortlessly. Above, mortals lived with deepened calm. Death's boundary felt not as a tier, but as a door, held open by order, but closed by inevitability. Temples to Hades multiplied, their altars shared with Persephone's promise of cycle and return. Life honoured death not in fear, but in recognition of its quiet justice, understanding that an ordered end granted meaning to every beginning. Vesper's form grew translucent at the edges, twilight robes dissolving into the mists, curling endlessly around the threshold. The lantern rested against the stone, flame a steady ember, no longer needing height or vigilance. Duty transformed, not ended, but completed, its weight released into the structure it had shaped. And in that release, the threshold stood stronger than ever, held now by the realm itself, the first guardian's endurance, woven eternally into its fabric. The underworld had reached its full measure of order. No longer formless, it was vast and intricately balanced. Asphodel meadows rolled like gentle seas beneath perpetual twilight, grey blooms releasing faint luminescence that needed no sun. Cypress groves stood sentinel along the rivers, branches interlacing into vaulted ceilings, beneath which shades moved in slow, deliberate procession. Obsidian halls rose complete, simple in design, resonant with eternity's weight. Hades occupied his throne at the heart, helm resting upon a low plinth beside him, his presence the quiet fulcrum upon which all turned. Vesper remained at the obsidian archway, though his form was now scarcely distinct, twilight and mist indistinguishable. Newly arrived shades crossed without hesitation, scarcely aware of the guardian who had once stood watch alone. They moved inward, guided by the calm authority of a realm that no longer needed its origin remembered to endure. The dead settled fully into eternal rhythms. In the asphodel fields, souls walked in measured circles, conversing softly without urgency. Warriors rested beside former foes, recounting battles as distant echoes. Mothers tended pale gardens that needed no tending. Kings walked unadorned among farmers and artisans. Hierarchies dissolved into shared shadow. Elysium glowed complete, silver, leaf trees sheltering memories, held without pain. Tartarus remained contained, unrest held in precise measure, no cruelty added beyond necessity. And so the underworld endured, ordered, complete, and breathing quietly. The first guardian did not vanish. He became the threshold itself. Above, the mortal world had woven death into its deepest fabric. Cities aligned streets toward the setting sun, tombs built with doorways facing west. Funerals became ceremonies of quiet release, bodies laid with coins for the ferryman. Cypress branches, pomegranate seeds symbolizing the Lord's union with spring's return. Mourners lingered at graves less, returning to life with acceptance born of knowing the boundaries of firmness. Children learned early that death was not end, but passage into ordered shadow where all found place. Temples to Hades and Persephone stood side by side, altars shared, offerings of dark wine and seasonal fruit left in cycles that honoured both departure and return. Hades ruled with increasing stillness. He rose from his throne less often, trusting the realm to maintain its balance. Cerberus patrolled the outer gates, but 3 heads vigilant yet passing souls, with measured growls that warned rather than threatened. Charon poled his boat across the dark waters, accepting coins or guiding the coinless with equal silence. The rivers flowed in perfect harmony, Lethe easing memory's weight with merciful precision. Styx binding oaths that echoed through both worlds. Atron carrying sorrow without overflow. Phlegethon warming without burning. Cocytus lamenting softly for those who needed it. Vesper's presence had diffused further. The lantern's ember glowed from within the obsidian itself now, light woven into the archway's span. His form stood outlined in mist, tall, spare, unchanging. Yet no longer separate from the threshold he had guarded since creation's dawn. Shades passed through him without disturbance, feeling only the faint warmth of long vigil. The boundary no longer required active holding. It endured through the order Hades had established, reinforced by the Guardian's essence, now embedded in its fabric. The Lord approached the threshold rarely, but when he did, he stood in quiet regard. No helm shadowed his face in these visits. Hades extended no hand now, the invitation long accepted in silence. He simply stood, acknowledging the first Guardian's endurance with eyes that carried the weight of shared duty. Vesper's translucent form inclined subtly, lantern ember pulsing once in response. The dead continued their eternal flow. A warrior shade arrived, wounds fresh in memory. He paused briefly at the archway, feeling the diffused light, then moved onward toward Asphodel without need of guidance. A child shade followed, hand reaching instinctively, finding only calm mist that settled the fear. An elder came last in that cycle, life spent in quiet service, eyes already turned inward. Above, mortals dream no longer of the threshold's pale light. When death approached, it came as familiar shadow, welcomed in old age, accepted in youth, understood as passage into the Lord's ordered realm. Stories told around hearths spoke of Hades, with reverence receiver of all, judge without malice, keeper of balance beneath the earth. Persephone's descent and return wove hope into the telling, cycles of loss and renewal mirrored in seed and harvest. Vesper felt the completion settle through his essence. The solitary weight that had defined him, since time's beginning, had fully diffused, not lost, but transformed into the boundary's enduring strength. The lantern's ember no longer flickered. It glowed constant from within the stone, light and shadow perfectly balanced. Hades returned to his throne, sitting in stillness that needed no movement. The realm breathed around him, mists rising and falling, rivers humming their low songs, shades moving in patterns as old as fate. The Guardian's vigil had reached its quiet apex. Not abandonment of duty, but fulfillment through release into the very order he had first sustained alone. And in that fulfillment, the threshold stood eternal, held by woven light and shadow. The first Guardian's endurance, now the realm's unbreakable foundation. The Underworld had achieved its timeless equilibrium, a realm where every shadow found its place, and every silence carried meaning. Asphodel meadows stretched endless under the soft glow of their own luminescence, blooms opening and closing in rhythms that echoed no mortal season. Cypress groves formed vast cathedrals of interlaced branches, their needles whispering faintly as shades passed beneath. Rivers wound through the landscape in perfect measure, Styx's dark coils binding oaths with unyielding thread. Lethe's gentle current easing memory's burden, Acheron's sorrowful flow carrying grief without overflow, Phlegethon's quiet warmth sustaining without consuming, Cocytus's low lament providing voice for those who needed it still. Obsidian halls stood complete, their walls reflecting nothing yet holding everything, the weight of countless passages, the calm of ordered eternity. Hades sat upon his throne of dark stone, helm resting eternally at his side, his presence the unmoving centre that allowed all else to flow. No movement marked his rule now, he simply was, and the realm responded in perfect accord. Cerberus lay watchful at the outer gates, 3 heads resting on massive paws, eyes half, closed yet seeing all. Charon poled his boat in endless circuits, silhouette steady against the dark waters, guiding souls with silence more eloquent than words. Persephone's influence had woven deeply into the fabric, her annual descent and return mirrored in subtle cycles. Asphodel blooms brighter during her presence, cypress needles greener, rivers carrying faint scents of upper world spring. Pomegranate trees grew in sheltered glens, fruit heavy and red, seeds shared among shades who remembered life's sweetness without clinging to it. Vesper's essence had diffused almost completely into the threshold. What remained visible was a faint outline, tall, spare, cloaked in twilight mist, that moved with the veil itself. The lantern no longer rested separately. Its ember glowed from the heart of the obsidian archway, light and shadow perfectly entwined. The boundary stood stronger than ever, not through active holding, but through the Guardian's complete integration. Newly arrived shades passed through the diffused presence, without pause, feeling only a profound calm. The sense that the passage had always been thus ordered. The dead existed in states of perfect acceptance. In Asphodel, souls walked or sat in loose gatherings, conversation flowing when needed, silence welcomed when preferred. Warriors shared stories of battles with the detachment of those who understood ambition's ultimate cost. Mothers tended to phantom children grown eternal, hands gentle on forms that needed no protection, yet received it anyway. Kings and commoners moved as equals, former hierarchies dissolved into shared understanding of mortality's great levelling. In Elysium, worthy shades gathered in glades where pale light filtered through silver leaves. Philosophers debated without heat, heroes recounted deeds with quiet pride. Lovers walked hand in hand through meadows that needed no sun to glow. Tartarus held its own. Depths where the unrestful endured the weight of their choices reflected back, chains not of cruelty, but of consequence, containment that allowed the greater realm its peace. Even here, Hades's order prevailed. No excess torment, only the precise measure each soul required for balance. Above, the mortal world had fully embraced the certainty of passage. Death was woven into life's deepest patterns, no longer feared as unknown void, nor romanticized as mystery, but accepted as inevitable transition into ordered shadow. Cities built vast necropolises with avenues of cypress leading to tombs aligned precisely west. Funerals became profound ceremonies of release, bodies prepared with care, wrapped in shrouds embroidered with pomegranate and asphodel, coins placed gently on eyes or in mouths for the ferryman. Mourners gathered in circles, sharing stories of the departed's life without exaggeration, grief flowing naturally, then receding like tide. Children grew hearing tales of Hades and Persephone as essential to the world's turning. Lord of the dead, who received all with justice, queen who brought renewal through her cycles. Temples stood prominent in every city, altars shared between the pair, dark stone for Hades, living vines and flowers for Persephone. Offerings varied with seasons, black wine and barley in winter, fresh fruit and flowers in spring. Priests and priestesses served together, teaching that life and death were not opposites but partners in eternal dance. Mortals lived with deepened presence. Knowing death's boundary held firm, they cherished moments without frantic grasping. Leaders ruled with awareness of eventual equality in shadow. Lovers loved fully, understanding separation's inevitability, yet trusting the realm's order. Artisans created works meant to endure, not for immortal fame, but for the joy of creation itself. Philosophers wrote of the underworld not as punishment or reward alone, but as necessary balance, the great receiver where all found place. Dreams of the threshold had ceased entirely. When death approached, mortals faced it with calm born of cultural memory. The knowledge that Hades waited not as devourer, but as lord who understood duty's weight. Persephone as queen who knew both loss and return. The dying often smiled in final moments, sensing the ordered realm beyond. Vesper's integration neared completion. What remained of separate form thinned to the faintest silhouette, visible only in certain lights. When mist caught the lantern's embedded glow, the boundary breathed with his essence, opening gently for arriving souls, closing firmly against any backward reach. The obsidian archway itself seemed alive, stone warm to touch, veins of pale light threading through dark like roots through earth. Hades rose from his throne infrequently now, moving through the realm only when subtle adjustment required his direct presence. When he approached the threshold, perhaps once in a mortal age, he stood in profound silence, regarding the diffused guardian with eyes that carried centuries of shared understanding. No gesture passed between them. Only acknowledgement, the first vigil's endurance, had become the realm's eternal foundation. Persephone, but during her seasons below, walked to the threshold sometimes. She stood where Vesper's essence strongest remained, but fingers brushing the warm obsidian, leaving traces of upper world bloom that lingered briefly before dissolving into mist. Her presence brought faint sense of spring, earth after rain, new growth. Reminders that the boundary connected rather than merely separated. The rivers sang constantly now, a complex harmony of 5 voices blending into one. Lethe eased final memories with perfect mercy. Styx bound the realm's order unbreakable. Acheron carried sorrow to its natural end. Phlegethon provided warmth sufficient for existence. Cocytus gave voice to lament that needed expression before silence. Shades continued their eternal patterns, moving or still as suited their essence, neither hurried nor constrained. Some gathered near the threshold's diffused light, drawn by the residual memory of the first guardian's vigil, a presence that had shaped their passage even before they understood it. They sat in loose, unstructured circles, no hierarchy among them, feeling the calm that had held the boundary steady through primordial ages. In that quiet radiance, they remembered themselves without pain or urgency, identities settling into clarity without demand. Others drifted onward, walking the long paths into Elysium, or resting amid the pale fields of asphodel, content within the order that had been established long before their arrival, and would remain long after their stories had stilled. Above, in the realm of breath and sun, mortals continued their lives with a profound and sobering awareness, knowledge of the underworld's structure, once myth, now internalized truth, shaped how they built and governed. Societies mirrored that balance with increasing fidelity. Justice systems emerged that punished without spectacle or excess cruelty, focusing on restoration and boundary rather than vengeance. Economies shifted away from endless accumulation towards sufficiency, but provision measured not by hoarded surplus, but by collective steadiness. Relationships grew more deliberate, honouring connection without erasure of the self, recognising that closeness endured best when shaped by mutual restraint. Death ceased to be terror alone. It became a teacher, quiet but uncompromising, reminding mortals to live fully within life's measure, to act without haste, and to choose without fear. Below, the Guardian's essence pulsed gently through the threshold. The final integration approached, not as dissolution, but as fulfillment so complete that separation itself lost meaning. The lantern's glow, once a separate flame, held against encroaching darkness, now illuminated from within the very stone of the archway. Light no longer burned, it existed, eternal, unquenchable, woven into the fabric of the boundary itself. There was no longer a point where vigilance began or ended. The threshold had learned endurance. In this near completion, the underworld stood perfect in its order. What had once required solitary duty had become shared, foundational equilibrium. The first Guardian's vigil, endless, silent, unwavering, had not vanished. It had multiplied, diffused into structure, memory, and function. His endurance no longer belonged to him alone. It lived everywhere, so deeply embedded that separation no longer held meaning or necessity. The underworld rested in perfect, breathing stillness, a realm where time had no need to hurry and every shadow knew its place. Asphodel meadows glowed with their own quiet luminescence, pale flowers unfurling and folding in rhythms older than seasons or sun. No decay followed their bloom. No urgency accompanied their closing. They existed as states rather than events. Cypress cathedrals arched overhead, their vast trunks forming natural aisles, needles whispering secrets to a wind that moved eternally through the branches. The sound was neither mournful nor joyful, but sustaining, a reminder that even stillness could speak. The rivers sang their five, part harmony without cease. Styx bound oaths with its cold, unyielding current. Lathe eased memory's sharpest edges, not erasing but softening what no longer needed to wound. Akron carried grief without judgment, allowing sorrow to pass without stagnation. Phlegethon warmed rather than burned. Heat contained, energy without destruction. Costis lamented softly, its frozen tears echoing loss without despair. Together, their voices blended into a single resonant chord that held the entire realm in suspension, a harmony so complete that no single note sought dominance.